Welcome to the CEC Report. It's May 25th. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, if Paul Howes was serious, he'd demand a national bank. To save the aluminium industry, return to the public credit which built it. And finally, Treason Dossier, your superannuation is Macquarie Bank's loot. First, if Paul Howes was serious, he'd demand a national bank. Now, we saw this week a very live demonstration of the importance of the CEC's resolution campaign, Craig, our Australia's Future Develop or Die resolution, where we demand an end to the Hawke-Keating, all the reforms since Hawke and Keating, and the enactment of a national bank and Glass-Steagall. And we saw it in an address to the National Press Club by a person who's fairly powerful in Australia, Paul Howes.
But he's very trapped, Robbie, in the current policies of this government and generally of the last, policies of the last 40 years.
Well, and here's the example of what you mean by trapped. He's the secretary, the National Secretary of the Australian Workers Union. He took over from Bill Shorten, who is the minister in the Gillard government, who everyone's talking about as the next Labor leader. In his address, he launched an attack on, believe it or not, the free market, the floating dollar, and the Reserve Bank of Australia. On the free market, he said the idea that's been around since the 80s that government should not be picking winners has to be dumped. The government should go back to picking winners, he said. Which
means tariff protection, implicitly, doesn't it?
Well,
you can't have winners without actually going back to protectionist measures.
Well, you've straight away said that, right? He was given an opportunity to say that. Well, I'll come to that in a minute, what he said. But he's basically saying that manufacturing is on the skids, and if the government wants manufacturing, it's going to have to get behind it. He attacked the floating dollar. What he said with the dollar is that it's way overvalued, and of course that is driving the export manufacturers to the wall. And then he attacked the Reserve Bank of Australia for letting banks get away with murder. They're not passing on the interest rate cuts, etc. He made a comparison, Craig, to South Korea, and he praised South Korea and how it became a strong economy, because he said they picked winners, and he also said that they used public credit to do it, right? So he made that point in the context of South Korea. But the whole thing, I was listening to it, and we're the ones who are the champions in Australia for this kind of policy talk, and I was stunned. Here's a senior Labor man. Remember, he was one of the faceless men who showed his power by being able to topple Rudd. And he's attacking what are effectively his own Labor government's policies. So, in contrast to yourself, in the question and answer period at the end of his address to the National Press Club, when the journalists asked him for specific proposals, he had nothing to give them.
That's because there is nothing inside the policy mix of globalisation and free trade and everything since the Hawke-Keating government brought in the 82-83 period that has smashed the economy that can now fix and solve the problem. And I think today's program, we're going to be talking a lot about this and shock a lot of people because, look, there is no policy solution. And Paul Howes is just simply mouthing off in order to win the votes and the support of a very, very disillusioned union movement that's being smashed, whether it be the manufacturers, the pilots, the aircraft workers, the auto workers, it doesn't matter. Whatever sector of the economy you're looking at, they're being smashed by these very same policies.
And people like him get on TV to be the defenders of those workers, but just to prove what you're saying, he showed he was a fake.
Yeah.
Because when he couldn't give specific proposals, because that meant attacking explicitly the government's policies, he then said that what excited him, what drew him to politics in the first place, was the thrill that he felt at the Hawke-Keating reforms in the 80s, i.e. the very reforms that caused everything he's complaining about, he described as a personal thrill. So what you're saying, though, Craig, about there's no solution inside these policies. Nevertheless, Howes is saying this because he does know he has to be seen to be defending the workers. He's expressing their frustrations. What would you say to them? What would you say to the workers, the genuine rank and file union guys who do feel this, if they're going to actually be able to change it?
Go back and at least listen to some of the words of John Curtin and Ben Chifley that fought for the common good. The policies of the current government aren't interested in the fighting for the general welfare of the population, this idea of the common good, which is what the trade unions actually stood for at one point, particularly under William Guthrie Spence and others of the original Labor movement. The Labor today, the new unionism that we have today, is actually just like a toy of the policies of free trade and globalisation. It was deliberately targeted that way to destroy the union movement. That's what the Hawke-Keating reforms did under Bill Kelting and so forth. They shut down the 300, 400 separate unions and brought them down to under about 60 or 70, something like that, in order to consolidate the entire union movement and therefore destroy it.
Top-down control over them.
Yeah. So the issue is the unions have to look for different ideas outside their comfort zone, because most of the people watching this program right now are so totally brainwashed about how economics actually works that to consider some of the policies that we're going to be discussing in the ongoing part of this show is going to bring shivers down their spine. How can we think this way? This is so far out of the public opinion. We don't see these ideas on television. Well, of course you won't, because they've become so ingrained as the norm that we're actually accepting the poison that's killing us day by day.
Well, thanks for that, Craig. When we come back, we're going to continue this theme with some specifics, and next we're going to talk about specifically how to save the aluminium industry, which is one of the industries that Howes was talking about, because it's in a real crisis at the moment. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Now we're going to talk about how to save the aluminium industry, return to the public credit which built it. This week, the Norsk Hydro aluminium smelter in the New South Wales Hunter Valley has announced it's shutting down, and that's going to cost 350 jobs there.
Well, that's interesting, Robbie, that given that hydroelectricity is some of the cheapest power that you can get, and aluminium is totally dependent on cheap electricity. Now we can't even support an aluminium industry.
Well, there's a flow-on effect from all the other free market rubbish in the economy, because they're having difficulty getting long-term supply contracts for the electricity. But it's not just that issue. Aluminium in general, Craig, is in a bad way in Australia, and the other big one is here in Geelong, here in Victoria. The Alcoa plant is in total limbo, and there's something like 600 or 700 jobs there, which those guys do not know whether they're going to be employed for long, and the odds are they won't be. Now, as you just said, aluminium smelting it's actually the most energy-intensive industry there is, which is why it sets up in places where there's access to cheap electricity.
That's because, Robbie, for people who don't know, that aluminium doesn't exist as the metal in nature. It actually doesn't exist in that form. It's because we made the discoveries on how to refine alumina, which is the aluminium oxides, and reduce that down into the actual metal that we've been able to produce metal. So aluminium wasn't around. It's only been around for, I think, about less than 150 years.
And but the other thing about aluminium is it's completely recyclable, and so it's it's an excellent product. It's been it's one of the products of the 20th century. Now, in terms of the industry in Australia, there's a number of things taking a toll. One is falling international prices, and that relates to the whole global economic breakdown. Because, of course, most aluminium smelted in Australia is not used in Australia, it's exported. Right? Another one is the high dollar, which compounds the falling international prices, because our dollar has been very high. And the other issue is the impending carbon tax, which, of course, it's going to make electricity even more expensive. The big target of the carbon tax is electricity. What I wanted to talk about today, just to give people the sense of how we got an economy like we did, is the history of this industry, because the history of this industry is a history of public credit in Australia. It's the only reason we have an aluminium industry. What happened was, back in 1970, the Liberal government of John Gordon created an institution called the Australian Industry Development Corporation. And they created it because they had an actual intention. They wanted secondary industries in Australia, specifically secondary industries that could value add to mining. They were sick of, and McEwen was part of a faction that actually crossed parties. Gordon was part of a faction that crossed parties. It included John McEwen of the Nationals, and it included people like Rex Connor and Jim Cairns of the Labor Party, right? They were sick of Australia exporting raw materials, and they said, we need manufacturing of those raw materials here in Australia. But of course that takes money. And the free market, private enterprise, was not capable of making those types of investments, especially with an industry like aluminium, which was so capital intensive. So they set up the Australian Industry Development Corporation, and the thinking behind it was this government corporation would borrow money from overseas at on the government's credit rating, which was the best possible credit rating. It meant they had the lowest possible interest on their borrowings, and they could on-lend that money into projects here in Australia. Before I get to aluminium specifically, when they passed the Act of Parliament, this is what the Act said, that the AIDC was to, quote, facilitate the establishment, development and advancement of Australian industries and the participation in those industries by Australian residents, that's a very interesting point, by providing finance to those engaged in the industries and by participating in enterprises or projects. So it was very clear what it was for. Aluminium was their big concern at the time. It was the big one. There was a 1970 cabinet meeting where figures were presented which showed that by exporting just raw materials, Australia was robbing itself. And in the case of aluminium, by exporting 1 million tonnes of bauxite, Australia earned $5 million. But if it was processed one step into alumina, that export earned $27 million. If it was processed one step further into aluminium itself and exported, it earned $120 million. And if it was processed a final step into actual aluminium products and those were exported, Australia earned $600 million.
600 times the value of the raw material.
It was incredible, right? Stunning.
Yeah.
So they went ahead and did this thing. In 1981, the Campbell Committee, which we talked about in the last few weeks, demanded that the AIDC be shut down as part of its reforms, which Hawke and Keating started. It was privatised by Howard and Costello in 1997, and only last year actually was what was finally left of it actually ceased to exist. It was wound up completely. Craig, my question to you is, although this Australian Industry Development Corporation wasn't a national bank as we're calling for, it was a way for the government to direct public credit to priority developments. Those governments intended Australia to have industry. The fact that we don't have such an institution anymore and we're losing our industries, isn't that also their intention? Their intention now is to destroy industries?
Well, Robbie, go back to what you said about Paul Keating. I mean, his intention, and he said it, Australia should only be a raw materials exporter. And I've done the work on this recently for our New Citizen, where you can see the massive growth in the export. For example, we're looking at, for a total combined, about $210 billion of exports. Now, and of that, metals, metal ores and minerals are approximately
That's
80.
per year, is it?
That's per year.
Yep.
So you're looking at about $85 to $90 billion in the export of metals. Now, I was just stunned as you were talking there to say, look, okay, 1 million tonnes of aluminium produce 600. Well, if we've got $90 billion, 600 times, do the maths, Robbie. That's a huge volume of potential value added that we're losing, pure and simple. Now, this was a policy shift by Keating deliberately to say we should be nothing more than a raw materials exporter. We've become that, and consequently we're losing and have lost the support, as we should have had, for developing our own manufacturing base. The AIDC was a classic example. Use the power of government to go and get cheap credit. We would say you don't even have to go overseas cap in hand to foreign banks or foreign institutions. You can use a national bank and literally say, we want this industry, we will create that credit out of, against the value of the future asset.
The potential it has, against its potential.
Against its potential, and the asset backed by the actual government itself. Now, you can make that decision to create that credit, you can support and make the decision to create those industries. If you choose it's a political decision, you can fund it through national banking. And that's really the crux of the issue here. If we want to have industry, if we make that decision and we want to have a manufacturing industry, just like Paul Keating says, no, we want to get rid of them, we want to have nothing but exports, then you can find the financing mechanisms to do that. And the national banking idea of creating the public credit against the assets, the future assets of the nation, against the existing assets of the fact that you have an organised government, then you can do these sorts of things. But again, this means that the entire system of globalisation, free trade, of the British monetary system that we've been talking about is completely done away with. And that's why we're calling for a Glass-Steagall internationally to reorganise the entire financial monetary system, to deal with this enormous amount of debt that we have in this system. It can never be paid, to deal with places like, for example, Greece, where the entire country is bankrupt and literally disintegrating under the weight of these, of the financial disintegration internationally. I mean, we're coming back to a point, Robbie, where we're going to be talking about national banking, the creation of public credit in a much more serious way over the next coming weeks and months.
Well, it's examples, understanding how something like the AIDC worked is an example of what a post-Glass-Steagall world would look like.
Yeah, well, when you've got domestic credit, in the case of the 70s, it's something like 8, 9, 10%, right? You go overseas, you get the credit for 2%. The government doesn't add much to it, just passes it straight through to the manufacturing sector, and they get the benefit of that credit. That's what they were trying to do there, and actually did that. And it was interesting that it was the Gorton government did that, because that was around the area where, Gough Whitlam and Rex kind of buy back the farm policies.
Well, I'm glad I was going to mention that. Gorton's enemies in the Liberal Party, like Billy McMahon, who succeeded him eventually, said their attack on his proposal was that if you set this up, you will give Whitlam and Cairns a tool by which to, they use the term socialise Australia, but which meant what Rex Connor and Cairns wanted to do, buy back the farm, etc. But Gorton, the fact that Gorton and McMahon and McEwen pushed ahead anyway, shows you how strong this sentiment for national development and national sovereignty was, even in the Liberal Party back then. And now it doesn't exist anywhere outside of us.
Well, Howard was the one that actually destroyed that completely within the Liberal Party when he came to power.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks for that, Craig. When we return, finally, the Treason Dossier this week, your superannuation is Macquarie Bank's loot. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, in this week's Treason Dossier, your superannuation is Macquarie Bank's loot. If you have a superannuation account, and you probably do with the way the economy is at the moment, and you're watching its balance fall, which you probably are because of the way the economy is at the moment, what you have to understand is you're losing that super because you were meant to. It's a lie that superannuation was designed to fund your retirement. It was designed to fund the financial markets. Now, in this week's Treason Dossier, again, this is one of the things that is attributable to Paul Keating. And we're just going to go through the details. As part of Keating's radical free market deregulation of Australia on behalf of the City of London, they knew beforehand it would wipe out many of Australia's productive industries. We had an industrial economy, and they knew most of them would go. And Keating's view, though, was, as Craig referenced just before, as we've talked about, that Australia's future in industry terms lay as a raw materials exporter to Asia. But he also had another dream for another industry. It was a real vision of his. He dreamed that a new industry could be created in Australia, an industry of financial services. And the question is, Craig, does it deserve the name industry? In one of Keating's biographies, the governor of the Reserve Bank back in the 80s, Bob Johnson, recalls how at a meeting of the Reserve Bank, Keating looked out the window across Martin Place in Sydney, and he said, "This is going to be the Wall Street of the South." That was his vision for Australia. Now, a book was published a few years ago called Unfinished Business, Paul Keating's Interrupted Revolution by David Love. This guy, David Love, is an unabashed admirer of Paul Keating. And he admits in that book that the bottom line with super was that Keating recruited Kelty, after they got to get the unions in line, basically, so that they wouldn't start opposing the reforms. They had to keep the unions under control. But they also had to get the unions to accept something, that this system of compulsory superannuation, which would force workers to forego wage increases in lieu of so-called donate or contributions to their retirement, right? And of course, the unions, most of them thought this is rubbish. Well, who are you to tell our members how to spend their own money?
But the unions also had their own agreements with their employers on their own union superannuation arrangements.
Of course.
It was already in existence. It wasn't like superannuation. It wasn't part of the scheme of the conditions for workers. It was.
And also, though, the average worker, their sense of their retirement was owning their own home.
Yeah.
Right? They weren't capitalists. They weren't thinking, I'm going to become a stock market player. Keating had a different view in mind. So on page 91 of this book, Love recounts that Keating and Kelty had to steamroll this opposition to compulsory super because, quote, unless the growth in savings and therefore in financial capital continued to accelerate, Macquarie, as in Macquarie Bank, and institutions like it could not manage to sustain the momentum of the growth in their overseas operations, and Keating wanted these as a new Australian industry, end quote. This was all part of his fantasy of creating a Wall Street of the South. Or more interestingly, Craig, as Love talks about in his book, he calls it the vision as the Antipodean Venice. And of course, that's a hell of an admission because Venice is the favourite subject of Lyndon LaRouche as the example of monetary imperialism, right? Where you set out to conquer the world based on your control of money. And these guys had a vision for Australia that we weren't going to be a sovereign nation that had industries to meet the needs of our own people. We were going to be a centre of international finance that could use workers' money, force them to hand over their money to fund managers that could then go and conquer the world with it. And what's Macquarie? Let's look at Macquarie Bank just briefly before I throw to you. Macquarie's whole business model is this. They take something that the government does, provides a financial service, whether it's building infrastructure or actually providing health services or whatever. They get politicians to pass laws where it's privatised. So effectively the government role is elbowed out of the way. Macquarie then comes in and replaces the government financing with private financing, which is automatically a higher interest rate. Then Macquarie imposes fees. Macquarie's business model is based on huge fees. It imposes fees on top of that. So this drives up the cost of everything in the economy. And they tell their investors, you're going to make money out of this, but it bankrupts the economy and eventually bankrupts the investors as well. So the whole system is a scam from beginning to end. Craig, in the time we've got left, what would you propose is a better system of guaranteeing people's retirements?
Well, Robbie, we put a press release out this week on exactly this subject because of the fact that you're seeing superannuation being wiped out. The problem is, Robbie, one of the indicators of this is what we've done before with the gross foreign debt. $1.3 trillion of foreign debt, which took off after the Hawke-Keating so-called reforms. You have a $1.3 trillion pool of money now so-called in the system, which is all going to get wiped out under the current arrangements of the casino economy of the global financial and financial collapse. The only solution here is to go with what we've called before a Glass-Steagall financial reorganisation and go back with national banking and then underwrite people's pensions with the national banking system of credit, pay them what is actually needed, and therefore you can stabilise the economy. If you don't move out of the model of the free trade, deregulation, globalisation system, everything's lost unless we go back to that sort of re-regulation.
And retirees can invest in a national banking system to fund infrastructure.
And that's the whole point.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Tune in next week for more.